The rain came down like a decision, sudden, hard, and impossible to ignore. Lewis tightened his collar, felt the soaked fabric cling to his neck, and watched the city blur into running graphite. He had 20 minutes to make the interview. He had rehearsed his answers all week. He had boarded buses at dawn, skipped lunch, tightened his budget, and told himself this was the one door that might open everything. On the corner ahead, a pylon of lights and cables cut into the gray. An on-location shoot, extras huddled under tarps, a camera crane like a small bridge over the sidewalk. A man in a raincoat, famous enough that the crowd softened at his movement, was walking toward a doorway. That man was Will Smith. Lewis hardly registered the name then. He registered the motion. Will paused, looked down, and stepped out of the safety of that doorway toward an old woman who had slipped from her cane and curled like a question on the curb. He thought for half a second of the interview, of the crisp print of his resume, of the letter he had handed his mother that morning. This could change everything. Then the remembered sound of his mother's hands on his cheek. "Help first, boy. Let luck find the rest." The memory brightened like a match in his ribs. Lewis moved. Before he reached her, Will had already crouched and pulled the woman up, his jacket shielding her bent shoulders. Crew members called for him to return, a director's voice edged with impatience. Will rested his forehead to the woman's temple and shook his head as if refusing a shot. He stayed. That small refusal, public, polite, stubborn, tugged at Lewis. He crossed the slick street, ignoring umbrellas that seemed designed to route around responsibility rather than shield it. The woman's hands were thin as paper, but hot with fever. Her breath came quick, shallow. Lewis felt the outline of her collarbone under his palms, felt the smallness of her wrist. He wrapped his jacket around her as Will frowned at a radio, then stepped back from the director's cue. The crowd watched, the camera waited. Lewis put an arm under the woman's knees, another at her back, and they moved her under the awning of a closed bakery. He smelled yeast and rain-slicked metal. A bus hissed by like an exhalation. A passerby offered a towel and then walked away. No one else asked. "Are you all right?" Lewis asked, though he was not sure what answer she could give. She blinked as if vowels were heavy objects. "Thank you," she said, voice a dry leaf. "Bless you, son." He sat her on the bakery step, folded his suit jacket under her head, and dialed for a cab. The interview clock hammered in his head. He could still make it if taxis ran smooth and the receptionist showed mercy. He thought of the position, of the polished interview panel, questions about metrics, culture fit, drive. He thought of how those same men and women would meet him with a glance and decide whether he belonged. The taxi stalled in traffic, a long hiss of trucks and fender splash. The old woman shivered. Lewis took his suit coat off and wrapped it around her shoulders again, because there was a warmth to shared fabric that felt less like charity and more like reparation. He spoke to her to keep her breathing even, told her about the city lights as though she could see them, told her small things, his name, that he had somewhere he had to be, which sounded ridiculous coming from a man holding a stranger's sleeve. She reached for his hand and squeezed so lightly it was a punctuation mark, not an obligation, but an answer. He arrived at the office 30 minutes late. The lobby's fluorescent light corrected the rain's honesty into a stagier, sterile truth. The receptionist glanced at his damp lapel and then at the appointment sheet, her eyes sliding past the small explains like a hand sliding off wet glass. "I'm Louis Mateo," he said, breath still ragged. "I had an interview scheduled at 11. She tapped a screen with a precision that felt designed to close doors. "We have a candidate at 11. You missed your scheduled slot. They began interviews on time." He tried to explain the measure of the thing. "There was an accident. I was helping." "We can't reschedule on the spot," she said. Her words were not unkind so much as efficient. A security guard appeared as if summoned by form and offered directions that meant exit. Lewis felt an emptiness like a hand opening in his chest. He imagined the room where people in shirt sleeves would nod through his practiced answers without seeing the jacket wet with another person's warmth.
Outside, the rain had less urgency. It had been negotiated by the day. Louis sat on the same curb where he had helped the woman, watched the street reflect neon. He considered calling his mother, but the phone felt suddenly small and private, an intruder. His hands shook with cold and with the hum of humiliation. He had, in one choice, traded a possible job for a certainty of having done something true. The old woman had been taken to a clinic 2 blocks away. Louis had insisted on staying until she was with a nurse. A volunteer bundled her into a small triage area, asked her name and family contacts. Louis waited in the plastic chairs that smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. He watched people move in efficient circles, forms, names, procedures. The world organized itself around tasks. Compassion sometimes had to buy its place. An hour later, a man in a pressed shirt and a face that had learned to know the exact volume of his own authority stepped into the clinic. He scanned the waiting room, and his eyes stopped on the old woman whose hand rested on a folded jacket. The color left his face like a signal. He hurried toward her, apologizing in a voice that had a hint of accusation softened by concern. "This is my mother," he said, clasping her gloved fingers as if anchoring her there.
He turned to the nurse, then to Louis. "Who helped you? Who was with her?" The woman spoke before Louis could, her voice small and clear. "A young man. He wrapped his coat around me, and he did not leave until I was safe." The man looked at Louis, really looked, and for a moment the clinic's fluorescent duty fell away, and what remained was a human measure. "What is your name?" he asked. "Louis Mateo," Louis said. "You missed an interview," the receptionist had told him. "We have procedures," the guard had recited earlier. But now the man, Arturo Moreno, whose name Louis would later learn belonged to the skyline-bending company with a glass lobby and a ruthlessly efficient HR department, did not ask about resume points. He asked, "Why did you stay?" Louis found, in the presence of the man whose posture announced 1,000 decisions, that his voice did not tremble. "My mother taught me to help when someone needs it," he said. "It felt like the only thing to do." Arturo's gaze moved from the woman to Louis's wet jacket to the set of his jaw. He exhaled and, without preamble to any corporate policies, reached for his phone. A short call later, and a voice at the other end of the line, the same receptionist who had closed a door, sounded unsure as she checked a calendar and then, because it now seemed necessary, reopened it. "We'd like to have him come in," she said to Louis, astonished at the suddenness of mercy. "Can you return?" Louis's heart stumbled between disbelief and a new, careful hope. He changed into a dry shirt, someone at the clinic borrowed one, and smoothed his hair with fingers that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain. He walked into the building that had earlier turned its face away with the gait of a man who knew he was being summoned. Arturo waited in the reception area, not in a distant office, but in the hallway where a candidate might find chairs and a water dispenser. His handshake was firm and precise, but not the clenched handshake of someone meeting a resume. He asked about Louis's experience, the quick, necessary questions, and then, as if testing for an inner architecture, he asked about an earlier choice. "When you saw someone fall," Arturo said, "what made you stay?" Louis told him about his mother, about the jacket, about the small certainty he felt holding another person's hand. He told the truth in words that were simple and immediate. They did not sound like talking points because they were not designed to be sold. Arturo listened, and at length he nodded. "People here can teach skills," he said. "We can teach software and systems and how to talk to clients. What we cannot teach as easily is what you showed, somebody who will stay when no one else will. That matters." He signed a form that felt like punctuation. The job offer was not an act of charity. It was a decision that placed character beside competence and gave the former weight. Louis read the offer twice, as if a gesture might dissolve under scrutiny. And then he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the dry shirt borrowed at the clinic. He accepted. Later, after signatures and a brief intake, Louis stepped out of the lobby. The sky had cleared into a pale blue that looked like daylight's apology. He found Will Smith near the edge of the set where an assistant packed cables into a van. Will's face had that mix of bemusement and something like a lecture to himself, the expression of a public man who had watched private goodness and felt it rearrange his view. "You did good," Will said simply. He did not make a speech. He did not ask for a camera. He had given up a scene that morning, the director had needed him, and he had chosen the woman over the scheduled shot. "I thought I knew what I was doing with my time," he said to Louis, as if confessing an earlier vanity. "But watching you today showed me something I hadn't thought about, that sometimes the scene worth saving isn't one that will play on a screen. Sometimes it's the one that plays in someone else's life." Louis blinked, surprised at the intimacy of the admission. "You helped too," he said. Will nodded. "We both did. And maybe that's the point. These things aren't grand. They're choices." Word moved after that, first as a small talk item among crew, then as a quiet recommendation. Arturo would later tell a small circle in a meeting how he had found a man who had not negotiated his compassion. Will Smith would later, in conversation with colleagues, say that the day taught him the dangerous flatness of fame if it forgot to be human. None of those ripples became a spectacle. They simply altered the angles by which two men measured their days. The job, when Louis began it, wasn't a lightning strike that erased earlier nights of worry. The work was steady, sometimes small, often exacting. He learned systems, answered clients, failed at presentations, and then learned to do them better. He kept a photo of the bakery step, nothing more than a grainy phone capture, to remind him of rain and a woman's hand. He gave that jacket back to the clinic when they washed it, and the nurse laughed and said someone else would need it one day. On the day that felt like a small anniversary, a year after the rain, Louis went back to the bakery, now a little shop with a chalkboard that always had a line of poetry. He bought a loaf and slipped a $10 bill into the donation box. Later, he walked past a film set where Will's crew had returned for another shoot. Will looked up, caught his eye, and lifted a hand as if in greeting. Louis lifted his own, and, in that shared, wordless motion, the two men acknowledged the quiet architecture of choices that had shifted their lives. When asked in an interview months later what had changed him most, Will Smith said, "It was smaller than a scene and larger than anything I could stage." Watching someone make the small choice, no one's watching them, no reward promised, reminded me that character is the thing that rewrites outcomes. I stopped trying to manufacture meaning and started letting it find me in other people's moments. Louis would remember that line and tuck it beside his mother's voice. In the end, what changed everything was not celebrity or luck, but a neighborhood's breath. A man who chose to stay, an actor who chose not to dodge a responsibility, and a CEO who heard a simple report from his mother and decided to measure merit by what people did when there was nothing to gain. If there is a single practical takeaway, it is small and stubborn. Kindness given without expectation carries its own return. It does not arrive as spectacle, but as an altered angle on life that opens doors not because it pleads at them, but because it becomes the kind of action that people trust with consequence. If this story moved you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs the reminder. And maybe, as a small experiment, do one thing today that has no return attached. You might be surprised who notices.